My family always made fun of my husband for not making as much money as my brother. At Thanksgiving, my mother smirked and said, "So, when are you going to find a real man who can provide?" My brother laughed, "Yeah, maybe he can work for me one day." My husband squeezed my hand and whispered, "Let it go." But I didn't. I stood up, pulled out my phone, and said, "Funny you say that, because as of this morning, my husband owns your company." My brother choked on his drink. My mother screamed, "That's not possible." My husband smiled and said, "Oh, it's very possible. Let's back up a bit. See, my family always had this thing about money. If you weren't making six figures, you weren't worth their time." My brother, Daniel, was their golden child. He was the type of guy who walked into a room and expected everyone to stop what they were doing just to acknowledge his existence. And the sad part? My parents fed into it. They never outright said it, but I always knew they were disappointed in me for marrying Alex. Alex wasn't a flashy guy. He didn't care about designer suits or expensive cars. He worked in tech, brilliant, dedicated, and ridiculously smart, but he didn't flaunt his success, which in my family's eyes meant he was a nobody. Daniel, on the other hand, owned a construction company. Well, owned might be a stretch. He inherited it from our uncle and basically walked into wealth without ever having to struggle for it. That didn't stop him from acting like he built it from the ground up, though. My parents loved to brag about him. Every conversation somehow led back to how hardworking and successful Daniel was. Meanwhile, they treated Alex like an afterthought. At family gatherings, they would talk over him, dismiss his opinions, and make little digs about his job. They called him an IT guy, like he was some low-level tech support worker, and not an engineer managing multi-million-dollar projects. My mother, especially, never hid her disappointment. "Sweetheart, you're smart, beautiful. Why settle?" she asked me once, as if my husband were some kind of consolation prize. I gritted my teeth every time, but Alex always took the high road. "Let it go," he'd say. "They don't define us." And I tried. I really did. But then Thanksgiving happened. We were all at my parents' house in Austin. The table was filled with the usual: roast turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and an overwhelming sense of superiority radiating from my mother and brother. We were halfway through dinner when my mother, with that ever-present smugness, decided to take a shot at Alex. "So, when are you going to find a real man who can provide?" I felt Alex's grip tighten around my hand under the table, silently telling me to let it slide. But Daniel? He just had to chime in. "Yeah, maybe he can work for me one day." He laughed, loud and condescending. That was it. I wasn't letting this one go. I pulled out my phone, opened an email, and slid it across the table to Daniel. "Funny you say that, because as of this morning, Alex owns your company." The room went silent. Daniel's face twisted into confusion as he grabbed the phone and started reading. My mother leaned over, squinting at the screen, and that's when the screaming started. "That's not possible," she shrieked, her voice echoing through the dining room. Alex leaned back in his chair, calm as ever. "Oh, it's very possible." Daniel's face was turning a deep shade of red. "What kind of sick joke is this?" I folded my arms. "It's not a joke. You've been mismanaging that company for years, Daniel. Running it into the ground, actually. You had so much debt that your board of directors was desperate for a buyout. And guess who they sold it to?" Daniel's mouth opened, then closed. He looked to my mother for help, but she was still busy sputtering in disbelief. Alex finally spoke up. "You might want to check your email. You should have received the official notice this morning." Daniel fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking. Seconds later, his face drained of color. I could see it sinking in now. I leaned forward. "Oh, and in case you're wondering, no, Alex won't be keeping you on as CEO. In fact, you don't have a job anymore." His chair scraped against the floor as he shot up. "You can't do this. That company is mine. Dad left it to me." Alex raised an eyebrow. "No, your uncle left it to you. And you drove it into the ground." "We just picked up the pieces." My mother was practically foaming at the mouth. "This is betrayal. How dare you go behind your brother's back like this?" I laughed. "Oh, you mean like how you've spent years belittling my husband? Acting like he was beneath you? Like he wasn't good enough for me?" Daniel was still staring at his phone, his face pale. Then, suddenly, he slammed his hands on the table. "I'll sue. I'll fight this. You can't take my company." Alex sighed, rubbing his temple like he was dealing with a toddler. "Daniel, you don't own it anymore. It's over." I watched as my brother's world crumbled in real time. And God, it was satisfying. But this was far from over. Because my mother wasn't the type to let something like this go. And Daniel? He wasn't going down without a fight. Daniel wasn't going down without a fight. He stormed away from the table, phone in hand, muttering to himself. My mother shot up after him, her face red with fury, but my father just sat there, silent. For once, he had nothing to say. I turned to Alex, squeezing his hand. He looked calm, but I knew him well enough to see the tension in his shoulders. He wasn't worried, but he wasn't celebrating either. This wasn't over. And I was right. The aftermath the next morning, the real chaos began. I woke up to my phone buzzing nonstop. Messages from cousins, aunts, uncles, some demanding to know what happened, others quietly cheering us on. Then the calls started. My mother, my brother, over and over. I ignored them. Then came the lawyers. Daniel had gone nuclear. He was suing. Not just for the company, but for damages. He claimed the sale was illegal, that Alex had somehow tricked the board into handing it over. It was ridiculous, of course, but Daniel was desperate. And desperate men do stupid things. Alex wasn't worried. He had done everything by the book. The buyout was solid. But Daniel wasn't just throwing a lawsuit at us, he was going after Alex's reputation. He went to the local news, painting himself as the victim of a hostile takeover, claiming his own brother-in-law had stolen his family business. He sobbed on camera about how he had worked his whole life to build it. It would have been funny if it wasn't so infuriating. The worst part? My mother backed him up. She went on social media, ranting about how Alex had ruined Daniel, how I had betrayed my family, how we were greedy and heartless. The comments section was a mess. Some people called her out, pointing out Daniel's financial troubles. Others ate up the sob story. My blood was boiling. But Alex? He was still calm. We don't need to defend ourselves, he said. The truth will come out. I wanted to believe him. But then Daniel did something even worse. The betrayal a week later, Alex's company, the real one, the one he had built from the ground up, got hit with a sudden, unexpected audit. IRS, Labor Board, even a surprise inspection from the city. It didn't take a genius to figure out what was happening. Daniel had pulled strings. He had friends in high places. And he was trying to bury Alex in legal trouble. This isn't just about the company anymore, Alex said, jaw clenched. He wants to ruin me. I had never seen him like this. Not angry. Not worried. Just cold. And I knew then, Alex wasn't just going to sit back and take it. He was going to end this. The trap I spent days digging. Every financial record. Every shady deal Daniel had made. I didn't even have to look far. The man was sloppy. Fraud. Tax evasion. Wage theft. Even some very questionable permits for his construction projects. I compiled everything. Neatly. Perfectly. Then, I made a call. Not to a lawyer. Not to the media. To the feds. I handed them everything on a silver platter. And then, we waited. The fall it took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of Daniel parading around town, acting like he was some kind of victim, soaking up sympathy from people too blind to see the truth. Then the hammer dropped. FBI raid. It was all over the news. Federal fraud charges. Tax evasion. Bribery. They seized his accounts, froze his assets. The company, the one Alex had bought, was clean. But Daniel's personal finances? That was another story. The best part? The IRS was involved now. He owed more than he could ever pay back. And just like that, Daniel went from wealthy businessman to completely ruined. My mother called me, crying. You destroyed him, she wailed. Your own brother. I didn't say anything at first. Just let her sob. Then I took a deep breath and said, No, Mom. He did this to himself. And for the first time in my life, I hung up on her. Alex and I sat on our couch that night, watching the news as reporters talked about Daniel's downfall. He turned to me, smirking. Was this too much? I leaned my head on his shoulder and smiled. Not enough. Just when I thought it was over, Daniel pulled one last desperate move. I should have known. People like him don't go down quietly. 2 days after the FBI raid, we got a call from Alex's lawyer. Not about Daniel. About my mother. She had filed a lawsuit against us. Her claim? That Alex had manipulated her son into financial ruin. That we had conspired against Daniel, stolen his legacy, and driven him to a mental breakdown. I don't even know what the hell she's suing for, Alex said, pacing our living room. You can't sue someone just because your son is an idiot. I sat there stunned. This was a new low, even for her. And then, it got worse. The smear campaign my mother didn't just stop at a lawsuit. She went to the press. Again. But this time, she wasn't just painting Daniel as a victim, she was attacking Alex directly. The headlines were brutal. Tech CEO destroys family business, leaves brother-in-law bankrupt, heartless takeover. A man's own family betrays him, sister turns against brother in corporate coup. Every article twisted the truth. Every interview made it seem like we had planned this from the beginning, like we had spent years plotting Daniel's downfall. And the worst part? People believed it. Not everyone, of course. But enough. Enough for Alex's company to start getting hate mail. Enough for his clients to start questioning if they wanted to keep working with him. It was all lies, but in the world of business, perception is everything. And Daniel knew it. Even with his accounts frozen, even with the FBI breathing down his neck, he was still fighting. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was just trying to take us down with him. The family divide then, the family turned. Aunts, uncles, cousins, people who had never cared about Daniel suddenly had a lot to say about family loyalty. You could have handled this differently. Did you really have to go that far? He's still your brother. It was insane. Daniel had been a selfish, arrogant jerk his whole life. He had mocked Alex for years. He had tried to ruin us, dragged our names through the mud, weaponized the legal system against us. And now that he was paying the price, we were the bad guys? I started getting messages. Some from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were threatening. Some were just guilt trips wrapped in fake concern. Maybe you should apologize. Maybe you can fix this. Maybe you can talk to the authorities, ask them to go easy on him. I blocked every single one. The last threat then, Daniel did something that actually scared me. A week after the lawsuit, after the smear campaign, after the family turned against us, someone tried to break into our house. It happened in the middle of the night. Security cameras caught everything. A man, dressed in black, wearing gloves. He tried the front door first, then the back. When that didn't work, he smashed a window. But the alarm went off before he could get inside. By the time the cops arrived, he was gone. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was vandalized. But we knew. This wasn't a robbery. This was a message. And I had a sick feeling I knew exactly who sent it. The breaking point, the break-in changed everything. Alex and I had been fighting back with legal moves, with logic, with patience. But this wasn't business anymore. This was personal. And I was done playing nice. The police took a report, but I knew how this worked. Without hard evidence, it would go nowhere. But I had a feeling Daniel was behind it and I was going to prove it. So, I did what my brother never thought I would do. I fought dirty. The setup I had spent weeks gathering dirt on Daniel. Bank records, contracts, shady business dealings. The feds already had enough to put him away, but I knew there was more. And I knew exactly where to find it. Daniel had a guy, someone who handled his side deals. A fixer of sorts. His name was Pete, a scumbag contractor who had been skimming money off the top of Daniel's projects for years. So, I called Pete. I told him I had a business proposition. A little bait to see how loyal he really was. And just like I suspected, Pete didn't give a damn about Daniel. For the right price, he told me everything. The fake invoices. The bribes to city officials. The off-the-books payments to avoid taxes. And the best part? He had emails. Emails where Daniel openly discussed fraud. Emails where he laughed about cutting corners on construction materials. Emails where he admitted to paying someone to send a message to Alex and me. That was all I needed. I sent everything to the FBI. And then I waited. 2 weeks later, Daniel was arrested. This time, there was no bail. No fancy lawyers could save him. The charges were serious: fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and even attempted intimidation. The break-in at our house? That was officially tied to him. Turns out, Pete had rolled over completely. He gave the feds every bit of information they needed in exchange for a deal. And Daniel? He was done. The media had a field day. The same reporters who had painted Daniel as a victim were now dragging his name through the mud. Every dirty secret came out. The family? They went silent. No more calls. No more guilt trips. And my mother? Oh, she still tried. She called me from a blocked number, sobbing, begging. He's your brother. Please, he'll go to prison. I let her cry. Then I said, you should have raised a better son. And I hung up. Daniel took a plea deal. 5 years in prison. His assets? Seized. His company? Legally and publicly mine and Alex's now. We didn't even want it, so we sold it for parts, making sure his name was erased from it forever. My mother? She tried to keep up the charade for a while. Claimed it was all a misunderstanding. But nobody believed her anymore. She lost her social circles, her friends, her status. And Alex? Well, for the first time in years, he smiled at a family gathering our own, without them. We moved on. We built a life free of their toxic nonsense. And Daniel? Well, last I heard, he's working in the prison kitchen. Guess he finally learned what real hard work looks like.